The snow fell in muted sheets, soft as feathers, heavy as silence, blanketing the ridges and valleys in a hush that pressed against the earth. Each flake clung to Eliza Marrow's lashes, stinging cold against skin already raw from the wind. Her boots, worn thin at the soles, had long since surrendered to the frost. She walked without knowing if her legs carried her, or if the storm itself dragged her forward, each breath a ragged thread unraveling into the night. Shame and fear clung to her more tightly than the frost, as though they, too, sought to bury her alive. She whispered to herself, hoarse and trembling, "They're going to kill us!" And the sound of her own voice dissolved into the storm. The world blurred at the edges. She could no longer distinguish where the sky ended and the frozen earth began. Her thoughts wandered to the town she had left behind. The sneers, the murmurs behind gloved hands, the sharp-lipped cruelty of Maggie Thorne repeating her disgrace until it no longer belonged to her, but to everyone who whispered it. Eliza had been pushed out not with force, but with silence that pressed colder than this blizzard. Men refusing to meet her eyes, women turning shoulders when she passed, the sheriff's half-hearted warning that she should not linger near the streets after dark. She had left with little more than a blanket, a scrap of bread, and the crushing knowledge that there was no place she could claim as her own. Her knees buckled, and she sank into the drift, snow rising up around her as though to cradle and claim her. She thought of her mother's hymn once hummed in kitchens long gone, the melody dim in memory, a song about sparrows watched over even in storms. No sparrow came for her. Only silence. Only wind. Her body curled into itself, desperate for warmth that would not come. She closed her eyes, waiting for the storm to end her in the gentlest way it knew, by swallowing her whole. But then the snow shifted, the crunch of heavy steps cutting through the muffled stillness. A shadow loomed. At first she thought the storm itself had risen into form. Broad shoulders carved against the white, bare skin steaming with the heat of life despite the snow clinging to him. Her gaze caught on the breadth of his chest, the old scars running across muscle like maps of battles won and lost. A buffalo hide cloak hung loose about his shoulders, but he wore no shirt, his body as unyielding as stone, as alive as fire. The storm seemed to bow around him, reluctant to touch. She wanted to shrink back, to vanish into the drift, but her limbs refused. He crouched beside her. His eyes, black as obsidian, searched her face with a calm neither cruel nor gentle, only watchful, as though he weighed whether she belonged to life or to death. Eliza tried to speak, her lips cracked and trembling. No words formed, only a whimper, a plea. The man did not answer with speech. He slipped his arms beneath her with effortless strength, lifting her as though she weighed no more than a fallen branch. Heat radiated from him, burning against her frozen skin, startling her back into pain. She wanted to scream, but the sound lodged in her throat. The world swayed as he carried her. Snow fell thicker, clinging to his hair and shoulders, but he did not falter. Each step cut a path she could not see, the landscape bending to his will. She forced her eyes open, and in the dim she caught his face. Austere, weathered, scar at the jawline, yet not unkind. He looked forward always, never down at her, as though his purpose had already been chosen long before she fell into his path. Her heart beat with fear and something stranger, a reluctant thread of trust. The lodge appeared at last, tucked beneath a ridge of stone and pine. Smoke curled faintly from its roof, fragile against the storm. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepped inside, and laid her upon a bed of furs near the hearth. Firelight spilled across the room, chasing shadows, washing the wooden walls in amber glow. The scent of pine smoke and dried sage filled her lungs. He moved wordlessly, stoking the fire, laying wood with practiced ease until warmth filled the space. Then he turned to her, his gaze once again steady, unreadable. Eliza clutched the blanket he draped across her, her hands trembling. "Why?" she tried, her voice raw. Her shame rose anew, tangled with fear. She was alone with a man whose people the town spoke of with equal parts dread and scorn. She had heard the names spat in taverns, the half-truths shaped into curses. Now one stood before her, shirtless in the storm, and she could not bring herself to believe the gossip or to ignore it. She whispered again, softer this time. "They're going to kill us." The words were for herself as much as him, a confession of dread. He did not respond with the language she knew. Instead, he stepped close enough that she felt the heat of him soak through her blanket, and in a voice low as the rumble of distant thunder, he whispered words in his tongue. She could not understand them, yet the cadence carried weight, a gravity that pressed against her chest. Her blood chilled, not from the cold but from the certainty in his tone, as though he spoke not of possibility but of fate. She shivered, clutching the blanket tighter, heart pounding with a new rhythm. Fear, yes, but also a stirring of something she could not yet name. His eyes lingered on hers a moment longer before he turned back to the fire, feeding it another log. Sparks leapt into the air, then settled into quiet flame. She watched his back, broad and unguarded, and wondered what kind of man faced the storm without a shirt, who carried a stranger into shelter without a word, who whispered truths that froze her blood though she could not translate them. The fire crackled, the storm howled beyond the walls, and Eliza Marrow understood that whatever hunted her in the world outside, something greater had found her here. And still his whisper lingered, echoing in her mind, each syllable heavy with promise, with warning, with a destiny that had already begun to close its hand around her. The town of Dry Creek wore winter like a scowl. Snow pressed heavy against the rooftops, turning chimneys into stoop shoulders, while the wind dragged dust and ice down the main street. Inside the mercantile, where the stove glowed with a grudging flame, gossip clung thicker than the smoke. Margaret Thorne leaned across the counter, her sharp nose catching the light, her voice slicing through the air like a knife against rawhide. "She's gone and good riddance," she said. Eliza Marrow always carried trouble in her skirts. "You mark my words, wherever she is now, she's dragging shame along with her." Other women nodded, shawls drawn tight, eyes bright with the satisfaction of judgment. Their whispers wove together, steady as the storm outside. A widow who'd turned her back on her kin, a girl too pretty for her own good, a mouth too quiet to defend itself. All of it became proof. In their telling, Eliza wasn't merely absent. She was condemned. The town did not lose people, it cast them out. Sheriff Harlan Crow stood near the door, his broad hands folded over his belt buckle, face carved from lines of wear. He said little as he listened, though his eyes drifted toward the frost-blurred window. He had known Eliza's father once, a decent man buried on a hill before his daughter had reached womanhood. The memory tugged at him, but the weight of his badge pressed heavier. To defend her now would brand him soft, and softness in a sheriff meant lawless nights. Still, when Maggie Thorne's voice sharpened into poison, she ran to the wilds, to them savages. "Don't you doubt it!" His jaw set, and his gaze cut across the room with a warning he didn't voice. The words spread faster than snow on the wind. By evening, the saloon buzzed with speculation. Samuel Pike leaned at the bar, his wiry frame coiled with restless energy, a grin that carried no humor. "If she's with one of them," he said, loud enough for every ear, "then she's as good as lost. But maybe there's coin in bringing her back. Or a reward in proving what she's become." Ezekiel Brand, thick-shouldered and mean-eyed, clapped him on the back, his laughter rolling like stones in a tin. The men drank to it, not out of belief but hunger, for profit, for cruelty, for something to set fire to the long winter. Meanwhile, beyond the edge of town, in the hidden lodge beneath the ridge, Eliza stirred against the warmth of the firs. She watched Dakota move with a rhythm born of silence. He tended the fire, stripped bark from wood, crushed herbs in a stone bowl. His presence filled the space without demanding it. She kept her blanket pulled to her chin, though her body no longer trembled with cold, but with unease she could not name. The town's voice still echoed in her mind, every insult, every glance of scorn, and now it tangled with the image of this man who had carried her from death's edge without a word. When he set a bowl of broth before her, steam rising fragrant with sage and bone, she whispered thanks though she wasn't sure if he understood. His eyes flickered, a shadow of acknowledgement, before he turned back to the hearth. It unsettled her, this quietness. Men in town had always filled space with noise, boasts, judgments, demands. His silence was heavier, and somehow more dangerous. Yet when her fingers brushed the wooden rim of the bowl, warmth spreading into her palms, she felt steadier than she had in months. In town, Sheriff Crow walked the snowy street alone, boots crunching. The weight of decision pressed at his shoulders. He'd heard Pike's scheming, Brand's laughter, the whispers swelling into certainty. By morning, there would be men riding out, claiming justice though it was greed that spurred them. He thought of Eliza's pale face, the hollow look she carried, and something twisted inside him. He could warn her, if he knew where she had gone. But snow covered tracks, and pride covered truth. He adjusted his hat brim against the cold and walked on, his silence no less damning than the gossip. Back at the lodge, Eliza gathered courage to stand. Her legs wavered, but she pushed herself upright, clutching the blanket like armor. Dakota turned, his gaze dropping briefly to her unsteady frame before returning to the fire. She wanted him to speak, to offer something, assurance, explanation, even reproach, but he remained as stone. Frustration burned through her fear. "Do you know what they'll say?" she asked, her voice thin but edged. "They'll say I ran to you, that I belong to you now, and they'll hate me more than ever." Dakota's dark eyes lifted to hers. For the first time, his voice came in English, rough and spare as gravel underfoot. "What they say is wind. Wind dies. You breathe still." Her breath caught. The words were plain, yet they struck like a hand closing around her chest. To be told that she still breathed, that her life still carried weight, was a gift she hadn't known she yearned for. She sat again, trembling not from cold, but from the shattering of something inside her. Beyond the lodge walls, the storm eased. Stars pierced the black sky, sharp as flint. Samuel Pike and Ezekiel Brand rode under that sky, their horses' hooves muffled in the snow. They spoke in low tones, planning where they'd search come dawn, their breath smoking in the cold. Pike's grin widened with each step closer to violence. "She won't last long out here," he said. "But if she has, she's his now. And that means she dies with him." Ezekiel spat into the snow, his eyes narrowing toward the ridge where pines loomed dark. "Then we'll make sure of it. Folks'll thank us for it too." Back in the lodge, Eliza lay awake, staring at the low rafters, the fire's glow painting them in restless shadows. Her body was warm, but her mind churned with dread. Dakota's whisper from before, the words she had not understood, echoed against her heart. Tonight, they seemed less like a warning and more like a promise, though she could not tell if the promise was of survival or ruin. And in the distance, faint but certain, she thought she heard the echo of hooves muffled by snow, carrying with them the judgment of a town that had already decided her fate. The days that followed blurred into pale hours marked by the hiss of wind against the lodge and the crackle of fire within. Eliza found herself caught in a rhythm not of her own making, a cadence drawn by Dakota's quiet movements and the slow thawing of her own body. Shame clung to her at first, a second skin she could not shed. Each time she reached for the bowl he set before her, or took a corner of cloth he left by the hearth, she remembered the women in town whispering of her ruin. Their voices haunted her even here, echoing louder than the storm. Yet necessity demanded she act, and in the smallest gestures she began to step beyond her fear. One morning, when Dakota returned from the woods with his arms full of pine branches, she rose from her place near the fire, and reached to take some from him. The weight nearly toppled her, but she steadied herself, breath pluming in the chill. He looked at her with surprise that softened into something unreadable, then allowed her to carry the branches to the hearth. No words passed, yet her chest warmed with the knowledge that she had been neither mocked nor dismissed. The town had always been eager to call her useless. Here, her hands proved otherwise. At night, while Dakota repaired his bow or sharpened a knife with patient care, she stitched. The blanket he had draped over her first night was fraying at the edges, threads dangling like brittle weeds. With needle and scrap thread he had left in a small box, she set about mending it. Her fingers shook at first, clumsy and weak, but steadiness came with practice, and the stitches formed a line as straight as the one she tried to carve in her heart. When he noticed, his gaze lingered, and though his mouth gave no smile, his silence carried the weight of approval. Her dreams, however, betrayed her progress. She woke often with her breath caught in her throat, recalling the sneers of Maggie Thorne or the hungry eyes of Samuel Pike. In those moments, the fire seemed too dim, the walls too thin, and her shame returned like a tide. One such night she sat upright, arms hugging her knees, tears streaking hot against her cheeks. Dakota stirred from where he lay near the opposite wall, his head lifting as though drawn by her trembling. He rose and moved to the fire, feeding it with another log. The flames leapt higher, filling the room with light. He did not speak, but when his eyes met hers across the glow, she felt seen in a way she never had before. Not judged, not pitted, simply seen. The storm outside relented for a day, leaving the sky sharp and crystalline. Dakota led her beyond the lodge, their boots crunching through knee-deep snow. He showed her where to find water, ice cracked open with the blunt edge of a stone. He pressed a knife into her palm, guiding her hand toward the frozen bark of a fallen tree, showing how to strip it clean for kindling. His touch was steady, his hand enveloping hers, and though he released her quickly, the warmth lingered. She felt the pulse of something rising. Fear and gratitude twisted together, with a thread of dignity that had been missing for so long. Later, as they sat by the fire, she whispered, "They said I was nothing. That no man would keep me, no home would have me. And I believed them." Her voice shook, the words dragged from a place she had never dared uncover. Dakota listened without moving, the knife still in his hand, the flame glinting off its edge. His silence stretched, and for a moment she feared he had dismissed her confession as weakness. But then he set the knife aside, leaned forward, and in his low gravel voice said, "They speak lies because they fear truth. You breathe, you work, you live. That is enough." Her throat tightened. Tears welled, but this time they carried not only grief but release. She looked at him, at the scars etched across his chest and shoulders, at the calm that anchored him, and she realized he spoke from a place of wounds deeper than her own. His words planted something within her, fragile yet alive, a spark in the ashes of her shame. But dignity is never born without trial. That night, voices carried faint on the wind, the sharp bark of laughter, the clatter of hooves breaking snow's hush. Eliza stiffened, rising from her place near the fire. She pressed to the wall, straining to hear. The sound faded, swallowed by the night, but her blood ran cold. "They're out there," she whispered. "Pike, Brand, they'll come." Her voice cracked, torn between fear and certainty. Dakota's eyes narrowed. He rose, crossing the room with the quiet grace of a predator. He lifted his bow, strung it, checked the edge of his blade. No panic, no rush, only the slow precision of a man who had faced storms far worse. Eliza's chest tightened. She wanted to beg him not to fight, to run, to hide. But something in his stillness told her he would not bend. She drew close, her hand brushing his arm before she realized what she'd done. He looked down at her touch, then back into her eyes, and for the first time she felt her fear shift into something steadier. "If they come," she said, her voice small but firm, "I won't hide. I won't be nothing." The words hung between them, fragile as glass yet harder than the silence that followed. Dakota studied her, his face unreadable, but in his eyes she caught a glimmer, acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. It steadied her more than any promise could. He turned away then, stoking the fire higher, sparks leaping into the rafters. His lips moved, whispering again in his own tongue, low and steady. She could not understand, but the sound pressed against her bones with the same weight as before, a murmur of fate carried in syllables older than the snow outside. Her blood chilled, though not from fear alone. For in that whisper lay the truth she had begun to sense. The men hunting them were close, and the reckoning they carried would not be held at bay much longer. The storm deepened, pressing its white silence against the world, as though to muffle every sound but the heartbeat of those who endured it. Within the lodge, the fire glowed hot, yet neither Eliza nor Dakota moved as though at ease. The crackle of flame could not disguise the weight in the air, the waiting. She sat wrapped in the mended blanket, her fingers tracing its seams as if to anchor herself. Dakota stood near the door, bow in hand, shoulders bare though the cold seeped in. He seemed carved from the very mountain itself, steady, immovable. Yet beneath the stillness Eliza sensed a tension wound tight as a drawn bowstring. The first knock of hooves carried faint through the snow, a hollow rhythm that did not belong to the storm. Eliza stiffened, eyes darting toward the sound. Dakota's gaze lifted, sharp as flint. He said nothing, but his hand slid to the knife at his belt. The air inside the lodge grew thinner, pressing against Eliza's chest until she could barely breathe. She knew who rode those horses. Men who carried the town's judgment like a banner, men who wanted her silenced, erased, punished for daring to survive. Pike's laughter carried through the night, muffled yet distinct, cruel as ever. Ezekiel Brand's voice followed, deep and mocking, tossing words into the storm as though to taunt the lodge itself. Eliza's skin prickled with dread. She pressed her hand against the log wall, the wood cold against her palm, as if bracing herself for the strike to come. Dakota looked at her, his dark eyes steady, and for a moment she felt anchored, though the world beyond seemed ready to collapse. Then the pounding came, a fist against the lodge door, hard enough to rattle the hinges. Pike's voice slithered through the cracks. "We know you're in there. Hand her over, savage, and maybe we'll leave you breathing." The words ignited Eliza's shame, every whisper from the town echoing inside them. They wanted her reduced to nothing, a token to prove their scorn. She pulled the blanket tighter, trembling, but her gaze found Dakota's back as he straightened. He reached for the latch, his movements calm, deliberate. When he opened the door, snow poured in with the wind. Pike stood astride his horse, lean and wild-eyed, Ezekiel looming beside him like a shadow carved of spite. Behind them, a handful of other men shifted restlessly, rifles slung over shoulders, breath rising in clouds. The storm swirled around them, but their eyes burned with heat that no snow could smother. "Thought you could steal her away?" Pike jeered, his grin sharp. "She belongs to this town, and the town says she's filth. You'll die for her shame." Dakota said nothing. His silence seemed to unsettle the men more than threats might have. He stepped into the snow, bow in hand, bare chest gleaming with frost. Eliza's heart hammered. She wanted to cry out, to pull him back into the shelter, but her voice caught in her throat. Ezekiel spat into the snow, his lips curling. "Kill him!" he muttered, and rifles lifted like branches in a storm. The first shot cracked the night open, echoing through the trees. Dakota moved like lightning, arrow loosed before the echo died. A man cried out and fell into the drift. Chaos erupted, gunfire sparking against the howl of wind, arrows hissing swift and merciless. Eliza pressed against the doorway, eyes wide, watching death dance across the snow. The storm blurred friend from foe, but Dakota's form burned clear, every strike, every motion deliberate, born of survival's discipline. He was not wild rage but measured fire. Pike lunged forward, pistol flashing. Dakota met him in the snow, knife against metal, the clash sending sparks into the storm. They grappled, breath steaming, boots digging deep into the frozen ground. Eliza's fear threatened to drown her, but something stronger surged, refusal. She would not watch him fall. She seized a length of wood from the hearth, embers glowing at one end, and rushed into the storm. Her hands shook, but when Pike turned his sneer toward her, she swung with every ounce of strength she carried. The blow caught his arm, the fire biting through cloth, forcing him to stagger. Dakota pressed his knife to Pike's throat, the motion swift as a hawk strike. For a moment, the world froze, wind howling, rifles raised, blood steaming against the snow. Ezekiel shouted, fury cracking his voice. But Dakota's eyes burned, and his blade pressed closer. The men hesitated, fear slicing through their bravado. No one wanted to test the steadiness of his hand. Eliza stood beside him, breath ragged, the ember stick falling from her grasp into the snow where it hissed and died. Pike's grin faltered. He spat blood, eyes darting between Dakota and the men behind him. "This ain't over," he hissed, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Dakota whispered then, low and harsh, words in his tongue that none of them understood. The sound carried like a curse, heavy as thunder. Eliza's blood ran cold. Even without knowing the meaning, she felt the weight of it, the promise of what would follow if they dared another step. At last, the men drew back, muttering, rifles lowering. Ezekiel's glare lingered, burning with a hatred that promised return. But even he knew the storm favored Dakota tonight. They mounted their horses, retreating into the blur of snow, their curses swallowed by the wind. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Dakota released Pike with a shove, sending him sprawling into the drift. The man scrambled to his horse, clutching his scorched arm, and fled with the others. Dakota stood motionless, chest heaving, knife still slick with blood, snow clinging to his hair. Eliza's breath caught as she watched him, an image of both savior and executioner, a man marked by violence yet bound by something deeper. Her knees weakened, and she sank into the snow. He turned to her then, his expression unreadable, but in his eyes she saw what words could not name. Recognition, respect, perhaps even a fragile tether between two souls cast aside. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, whispering, "We'll never be safe." Takota stepped closer, his shadow falling across her in the firelight spilling from the lodge. He lowered his blade, but his whisper came again, the same murmur that had haunted her since the night he found her. This time she heard it clearer, each syllable heavy, final. Her heart jolted, for though she still could not understand the words, she knew they were not a warning alone. They were a vow, and its meaning would change everything. The night after the clash lay heavy with silence, the storm easing into a hushed calm as though the land itself exhaled. The snow glowed silver under the faint moon, softening the jagged scars of battle. Eliza sat by the hearth inside the lodge, her hands trembling though the fire burned high. She stared at the flames, watching them lick upward, restless and alive, while her mind replayed every sound. The crack of rifles, the hiss of arrows, the curses hurled into the storm. Shame still clung to her, whispering that she had been the cause of it all, yet beneath that shame flickered a new, fragile ember. She had not hidden, had not let fear consume her. She had swung the burning branch, and in that moment, she had refused to be nothing. Takota sat across from her, his chest bare and scarred, the knife at his side cleaned but not sheathed. He had bound a cut along his forearm, the cloth dark with blood, yet his posture remained unbent. He watched the fire with the same steady gaze that unnerved her when he turned it on her, a gaze that saw through the layers she wished to keep hidden. For a long while neither spoke, the quiet filled only by the hiss of pine sap in the flames. At last Eliza whispered, "They'll come back. They'll tell the town I chose this. That I chose you." The words scraped her throat, born of fear but also of a truth she no longer wished to deny. Takota lifted his eyes to hers. His voice, rough and low, carried the weight of stone worn by centuries of water. "You chose to breathe. You chose to stand." His answer struck her deeper than any comfort could. She felt her cheeks burn, not with shame but with something akin to pride. Her hands clenched around the blanket draped over her shoulders. The firelight painted him in bronze and shadow, his scars gleaming like lines of a story carved into flesh. For the first time she wondered if he had borne judgment heavier than hers, and if dignity, for him, had always been earned in silence. Morning broke clear and cold. The snow lay untouched around the lodge, the storm's fury replaced by stillness. Eliza stepped outside, her breath curling into the air, her boots crunching against the frozen crust. The world seemed reborn, every pine needle heavy with white, every ridge softened by light. She tilted her face toward the sun, its pale warmth brushing her skin. She felt alive in a way she had not for months, and with that breath came a decision. She would no longer bow to the town's whispers. If they called her ruined, she would carry ruin as her crown. Behind her, Takota emerged, silent as always, the cloak draped across his shoulders. He stood beside her, his shadow long against the snow. They did not speak, yet the space between them hummed with unspoken vows. She glanced at him, at the steadiness in his stance, and realized that her survival was no longer hers alone. It was theirs. By midday, the sound of hooves returned. Eliza's heart stuttered, but when the riders appeared it was not Pike or Brand leading them. It was Sheriff Harlan Crow, his hat pulled low, his rifle across his saddle. He reined in at the lodge, eyes sweeping over the ground where blood had stained the snow, now frozen dark. His jaw tightened. "I heard what happened," he said, voice flat. "The men are back in town, telling their story. They call you a thief, Red Hawk. They call her worse." His gaze flicked toward Eliza, heavy with something between pity and resignation. "But I saw the tracks. I saw who fired first. I won't chain you." The relief that washed through Eliza was tempered by the finality in his tone. Crow shifted in his saddle. "But the town won't forgive. They'll never let it rest. You've made your choice, girl. Don't look for welcome again." His eyes softened a fraction before he turned his horse and rode away, his figure swallowed by the trees. Eliza stood frozen, her breath ragged. His words stung, not because they surprised her, but because they confirmed what she had always known. She looked at Dakota. His face betrayed no shift, but his hand rested on the knife at his side, fingers curled as though ready to fight every battle the world might throw at them. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing his wrist, pulling his hand gently away. "No," she whispered, her voice steady now. "Not every fight. Not anymore. We stand, but we stand together." The fire burned high again that night. They sat side by side, the air thick with smoke and the closeness of two souls bound not by ceremony but by survival. Eliza turned the mended blanket over her knees, her stitches uneven yet strong, each thread a testament to her own worth. Dakota watched her, his silence heavy with things unspoken. At last he lifted his hand, rough and scarred, and laid it over hers. His touch was neither soft nor hesitant, it was steady, grounding, as though to say that no storm could move what had been forged here. Eliza's throat tightened. She met his gaze, the firelight glinting in his eyes. No vows were spoken, yet the truth settled deep. She belonged not to the town's scorn, nor to shame, but to herself, and now to him, in a bond beyond words. The snow outside pressed close against the walls, but inside the fire roared, alive with promise. She leaned closer, resting her head against his shoulder, her voice trembling with the weight of a choice finally made. "Let them call me what they will. I know who I am." Dakota's lips moved, whispering once more in the language she did not know, the same vow he had spoken on the night he carried her from death. This time, the words no longer froze her blood. They burned instead, fierce and unyielding, as though the fire itself had settled in her chest. She closed her eyes, letting the sound bind her to the moment, to him. Outside, the snow fell again, soft and relentless, covering every scar in the earth. And as the flames flared high, Eliza knew that whatever storms lay ahead, she would no longer walk bowed by shame. She had stood in the ashes and found her dignity. She had chosen, and in the silence between his whispers, a vow greater than words had been made.